You're recording.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this learning session of the Forest and Climate Initiative. Today we are going to talk about relevance of consultation and free, prior, and informed consent to REDD. We have the pleasure of having Jenny Springer and Vanessa Retana from the Rights and Livelihood Program of WWF US. So to tell you a little bit more about the Forest and Climate Initiative, this is one of the 13 initiatives of WWF that are worldwide, and particularly the Forest and Climate Initiative works on REDD worldwide. So our vision is that REDD significantly contributes to the conservation of tropical forests and thereby to the reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation for the benefit of people and nature. In this respect, the Forest and Climate learning sessions aim to leverage knowledge and share our expertise. So we believe that learning and capacity building is key to have up-to-date information on latest developments on REDD. So for doing this, every month we invite one of our experts so colleagues from WWF and beyond can have an opportunity to improve their skills on REDD. So today the key topic is consultation and free, prior, and informed consent and how relevant is in REDD. So we know that REDD has the potential of increasing international support for strengthening of community land and resources rights and forest stewardship activities of indigenous peoples and local communities. However, also the REDD mechanisms has sparkled some concerns about potential adverse impact on indigenous and community rights and livelihoods. So in this particular session, we are going to discuss which are the most important things to take into consideration when working with indigenous peoples and local communities. And also Vanessa and Jenny are going to show us some best practices that have been identified from around the world. So as I said before, we have the pleasure of having Jenny Springer. She is a cultural anthropologist with over 20 years experience in community-based natural resource management, indigenous issues, and rights-based approaches to conservation. She works with WWF offices around the world to promote and support approaches to scaling up community-based conservation, increase capacity and partnerships for them, and facilitate learning from WWF's experience. Also, we have the pleasure of having Vanessa Retana with us. She's a Costa Rican-born lawyer and currently focuses on REDD issues with WWF. She started out her career in law before moving into international public sector programs. She has specialized in the field of human rights and international environmental law, with an emphasis on climate change, biodiversity governance, traditional knowledge, cultural heritage, and poverty and inequality challenges faced by local communities and indigenous peoples. So we thank them for being here with us today. And just for some rules for this webinar, we ask you participants please to use and watch your chat window to put questions. You need to mute your microphone so we reduce background noise. And as I mentioned, you can write questions and they will be answered at the end of this session. If you have trouble connecting, please contact me on the chat window. And finally, this session will be recorded and posted in the Forest and Climate Initiative YouTube channel, so you can view it on a later date and also share it with your colleagues. So thank you for being here, and now I'm going to pass the presentation to Jenny Springer and Vanessa Retana.
Thank you, Maria. My name is Jenny Springer.
I'm with WWF US, and together with Vanessa Ratana, we'll be presenting today on relevance of consultation and FPIC to REDD. This is part of FCI's webinar series, and thanks to everyone for joining. The main objectives of the presentation are to I can't advance the slide. I don't know why. Sorry.
Okay,
Thank you, Maria, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jenny Springer, and together with Vanessa Ratana, we'll be presenting today on relevance of consultation and FPIC to REDD+. The main objectives of the presentation are to strengthen common understanding on participation, consultation, and free, prior, and informed consent issues relevant to REDD, and also to share emerging lessons and recommendations to strengthen ongoing REDD+ activities. We'll basically split the presentation. I'll focus on the common understandings, and Vanessa will present emerging lessons. And we'll touch on why consultation and free, prior, and informed consent are important for REDD, some definitions, principles, and free, prior, and informed consent procedures, and then emerging experience. Okay, so first of all, why are consultation and consent important for REDD+? Well, the main reason is that REDD+ is going to imply changes in forest management and forest use activities, which carry both potential risks as well as potential benefits for indigenous peoples and local communities. Some of the risks and potential benefits are outlined here in the presentation, and the main point is that consultation and free, prior, and informed consent will enable communities to guard against risks of negative impacts and also help them to take advantage of potential benefits and shape REDD+ initiatives in ways that support them, their livelihoods, their cultures, their traditional management systems, and all of this will also be vitally important for successful REDD+ outcomes. Some definitions. Consultation and consent are often used interchangeably, but they do derive from different sources and have some distinctions. Have a lot in common, but also distinctions in their meaning. Consultation refers back to the principle that citizens have rights to participate in decision-making on environmental matters. And this is established in Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, as well as in the Aarhus Convention of the EC. For WWF in particular, we have also specifically endorsed rights of citizen or people to participate in decision-making on environmental matters through our conservation and human rights framework. Free, prior, and informed consent refers even more specifically to the principle that indigenous peoples have a right to give or withhold consent to actions that affect them, especially actions affecting their traditional lands, territories, and natural resources. And this right is established in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted by the UN in 2007, as well as in the ILO Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples, and again in WWF's Indigenous Peoples Policy and the Conservation and Human Rights Framework also specifically adopt this endorse FPIC. Sometimes some questions arise as to what's appropriate in different contexts, consultation or consent, and including who has rights to free, prior, and informed consent. As just mentioned, indigenous peoples, the rights to free, prior, and informed consent is very clearly established for indigenous peoples in international legal instruments. At the same time, there's emerging recognition that that free, prior, and informed consent is linked to collective and customary rights, and in some cases there are also other local communities who may not be considered or identify themselves as indigenous peoples, but do have collective customary rights to their traditional lands and resources, and who would also have rights to free, prior, and informed consent. There's also increasing recognition that the underlying principles and the practices or procedures for consultation and consent have a lot in common, and that all forest-dependent communities or all people who might be affected by projects in their areas should be engaged fully and meaningfully, and that the main distinction is that the right to give or withhold consent may distinguish the roles of indigenous peoples from other forest-dependent communities. And this is something, for example, that's been outlined in recent guidance produced by Oxfam. So what are some kind of overarching principles for participation in consultation? One is that consultation should be meaningful and not shallow. This means that people's views are actually reflected in the decisions that are taken. It means that all parties have sufficient capacity to participate, and that may require capacity strengthening for some. It means that sufficient time should be built into participation in consultation processes to enable effective participation and for views to be effectively voiced. It implies inclusive and legitimate representation. It implies also that processes should be transparent and accountable, and that all voices, especially those of the marginalized, should be included. And participation in consultation should be ongoing throughout the planning, implementation, and monitoring of activities. Similarly, principles for free, prior, and informed consent are, well, they're captured largely by the title. They should be one principle is that processes should be free from coercion or manipulation. The process should be prior to decision making, such as allocation of land for particular purposes or approval of specific projects, and the lead time should also respect the time requirements of indigenous decision making processes. Consent should be informed. That's based on full information at least about the nature and scope of any proposed project. And that consent should be obtained through customary or other community-defined decision-making processes. And communities should be able to say yes or no at each stage of a project or process. So these are general principles and guidelines related to participation, consultation, and free, prior, and informed consent. Given their importance to REDD, plus these concerns have been integrated into some relevant REDD Plus standards, including through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has adopted safeguards on full and effective participation of relevant stakeholders, particularly indigenous peoples and local communities, and also on respect for the knowledge and rights of indigenous peoples and members of local communities, noting that the UN General Assembly has adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which refers specifically to free, prior, and informed consent. The REDD Plus social and environmental standards, a set of voluntary standards for government-led REDD initiatives, also adopts a provision of free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples and local communities, the rights holders to lands and resources, for activities affecting their rights to lands, territories, and resources. Under the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and UN REDD guidelines, they've developed stakeholder engagement for REDD Plus readiness that provide some guidance on effective participation and consultation processes. And UN REDD has additionally developed guidance specifically on free, prior, and informed consent. There have been going through several drafts circulated for comments, some of the key provisions included are that national guidelines on free, prior, and informed consent should be developed as part of national REDD+ strategies, and that these should importantly include definition of who gives consent based on mapping of rights holders. They should include a definition of which activities will require FPIC, and also how FPIC will be applied at national levels as well as at community levels. While free, prior, and informed consent procedures need to be appropriate to the particular cultural and governance contexts of communities, it is possible to derive a set of general procedures that can help to provide some guidance on this. We have developed some broad-based guidelines along these lines for WWF that draw on other recent guidance that has been produced by organizations like RECOPT and GIZ, Forced Peoples Program, Oxfam, and others. And so the next couple of slides summarize some of the main steps of this. The first is to identify who are the customary rights holders to land and resources, and what their customary lands are. The second main step in these generic procedures is to identify and also engage with appropriate community decision-making institutions and authorities, and especially keeping in mind that these must be institutions that communities choose themselves. Third step is to identify and engage support organizations. This is important as often indigenous peoples have representational or representative organizations at national levels that can help provide links to enabling policy frameworks in that country, and also maybe that communities will have need to access independent information from other technical experts regarding their rights and implications of any proposed initiatives. A fourth step is to build mutual understanding and agreement on a locally appropriate FPIC process. This is really critical. This is where the adaptation and to local decision-making processes take place. This can include considerations of who makes decisions, what are the time frames, how potentially marginalized groups will be involved, requirements to reach a decision, and points along the process at which FPIC is needed. A fifth element or step in the process is to provide information. We understand FPIC as an iterative process, which means it's not something that happens once, but is ongoing throughout all stages of any kind of a REDD or other initiative. So, for example, at the first stage of initiating process, the relevant kinds of information might include general information on climate change, REDD+, what is free, prior, and informed consent, what kind of assessments are proposed. At a next stage of a REDD+ initiative, the information might relate more to specifics of proposed project designs, results of assessment, benefit sharing arrangements, etc. And at the next stage of getting into project implementation, of course, information needs to include any specific terms of an implementation agreement that are based on the results of negotiation. Okay, next element or step is to engage in negotiation and based on information and based on full provision of information and to support decision making, which may also require some further inputs to communities to meet their needs for technical advice. A seventh element is to document consent-based agreements. This is extremely important in relation to FPIC, and a specific agreement should be documented in a mutually agreed form. And next element is to, of course, support and monitor the implementation of those agreements. and as part of this, to establish and operate a conflict resolution mechanism that can provide a process for resolving any differences that may arise in the course of implementation. And then a 10th, the last key element is verifying consent. And verification by a third party both helps to guard against manipulation of FPIC processes, and it enables proponents of REDD+ and other activities to demonstrate that they've respected this right. So at this point, I'll hand over to Vanessa for the second half of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. So now we are going with my screen. And in this second part of the session, okay, so it's fine. Can I start?
Yes, go Vanessa.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny. So in this second part of the presentation, we are going to see how the principles that Jenny discussed are currently being implemented, and what emerging good practices are arising right now. And we are also going to discuss 3 case studies that may help to illustrate better the challenges that these consultation and free, prior, and consent processes imply. First of all, it's important to know, as many of you REDD+ practitioners already know, that there is no one-size-fits-all easy procedure that we can recommend to you. Indeed, there is no standard formula at the international level for consultation and consent processes, or for processes that aim to actually implement the right to consultation and the right to consent. And this is not something that is exclusive of consultation and consent. Indeed, we also find this situation of no one size fits all for other types of rights. And it is established this way, as you can see in the screen, on Article 34 of the ILO Convention on the Rights of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Living in Independent Countries, which is Convention number 169 that Jenny was discussing. In this convention, it is stated that the nature and scope of the measures, which apply also the rights, the nature and scope of the measures that aim to implement the rights that are protected by the convention have to be determined in a flexible way, and that the conditions and characteristics of each country have to be taken into consideration. We would add to this that also the particular cultural characteristics of each community have to be duly pondered for every process that aims to implement the right to consultation and or the right to consent. Of course, we are not able to discuss in the time that we have all the emerging good practices that we could have discussed because of a time issue. So what we have done is to select a few of them and then try to illustrate them with the case studies that we have brought. First of all, it is important that communities need tools to understand and engage in discussions, and afterwards to make decisions that will affect them. And these decisions will most likely have an impact on their rights, on their livelihoods. So the capacity and awareness processes is something that it's something of a huge importance. So training is always the starting point. And when I say training, I mean training that the capacity of communities have to be strengthened, but we don't have to go to communities and imply that communities don't have already a wealth of knowledge. about ways on which they manage the forest, and a wealth of knowledge on how to make decisions about REDD+. So the approach has to be an approach that considers communities and their members as right holders and as peoples who already, as I said, have a wealth of knowledge, be it traditional knowledge or technical knowledge, on how to manage their forests and resources. Secondly, we should think not so much about how communities adapt to REDD, but how REDD+ adapts to the community's own agenda, priorities, and concerns. We are going to discuss it more in the Ecuador case study. In third place, when local organizations at the community level need to be strengthened, and when their own governance structure also needs some type of strengthening process, this needs to be included in the project cycle, and this needs to be also budgeted. And finally, it is very important to make the links from the local to national levels, which means that frequently at the subnational or national level, there are federations or caucus of indigenous peoples who already have experience in REDD+ and who can give a more independent advice and capacity building to communities. So it's important to make these links. And now we're going to discuss the Sociobosque program, which is a program that is pretty well known worldwide. It's a program that is led by the Ministry of the Environment of Ecuador. And in the particular case that we are discussing, we are going to discuss a contract that was signed between the Sociobosque program and the Shuar Federation, which is an indigenous federation of the Shuar people of Ecuador. In this case, the emerging good practice that we want to highlight is the fact that the Ministry of the Environment identified the life plan or Plan de Vida of the community as a good baseline for implementing the Sociobosque program. And in this case, it's important also to clarify a little bit for those of you who are not aware of what a life plan is. A life plan amongst indigenous peoples of Latin America is frequently a plan where they state how they want to put in place their well-being for the future, and this is done accordingly with their well-being notions, with their visions of the world, and with all the cultural background. So it's not, as you can see, it's not a development plan, but it's a Plan de Vida. It's a life plan that aims to implement how communities view their future and view their well-being. In this case, it was also important that on the part of the government, the Sociobosque program made an effort to strengthen the community organization. So this was an element that hugely facilitated that communication flow. And this was something very important for the success of this particular initiative. And finally, one lesson learned in this case study is that when it comes to implementing the life plan, it is important to define from the outset what are going to be the investment priorities and how the implementation of these priorities is going to be monitored. Because if not, then there might be disagreements amongst the community and between the community and the government on how they're going to actually invest the benefit sharing that they're going to obtain of the project. Now we are going more into emerging good practices on consultation and prior and informed consent. And this is the first of two slides. First of all, something that is very basic and that Jenny already mentioned is that consultation should begin from the outset of any REDD+ initiative. So since the design of the project, communities should be involved. And this is very important. It is also very important to respect communities' own protocols and structures for decision making, which may or may not adjust to the project cycle. So this is something that is very challenging. But if a REDD+ initiative wants to comply with international standards on human rights, international standards are very precise when asserting that the decision process has to adapt to communities' own protocols and structures on decision making. So this is very clear from the international level. It is also important to facilitate, since the beginning of the consultation and/or consent process, how women are going to participate. So gender has to be mainstream in an appropriate way, which not necessarily always implies making separate workshops for women. There are other methodologies for gender mainstreaming. We have to understand appropriately what is the role of women in the community, what is their role in livelihoods, how do they have access to property, how do they have access to natural resources, and whether there are discrimination issues that we have to tackle. So all these have to be considered when we are designing, implementing a consultation or consent process. And of course, this also applies to other vulnerable groups within the community, as youth, as the elderly, as people living with HIV, as people who also have some type of health issues or of condition that place them in a less favorable way within the community. The communication is it's also a key issue, and communication has to be proactive, not only on the part of the community, but particularly on the part of the project developers, because it's important that communities are always updated on how the project is moving on, what trouble we are having, whether there are governance issues that have to be tackled. This communication also has to be culturally pertinent, which implies that, for instance, in capacity building processes, sometimes orality has to be favored over other types of communication, because orality is the way that many local and traditional communities communicate. Let's remember that many languages right now of indigenous peoples are not written. These are languages and communications that favor orality over other ways of transmitting information. And as I said, this has also the final point is that we have to work with flexible timelines, because we have to ponder communities' protocols and communities' traditional ways of decision making. And this implies following community timeframes. This is something that we may need to communicate to donors, to multilateral agencies, or to the sponsors of the project, because it's something that, as I said, may not necessarily coincide with the project timeline. But this is something that has to be respected if we want to actually adhere to international standards in this matter. The second case study that we have is a consultation and consent protocol that was prepared by FAPI on 2011. FAPI is the Federación por la Autonomía de los Pueblos Indígenas de Paraguay, which in English would be something like the Federation for the Self-Determination of Indigenous Peoples of Paraguay. The protocol, it's of course very comprehensive, but we are going to discuss only a few interesting features. First of all, is that the right to consent, to grant it or to do not grant it, or to grant it partially, is a right that belongs to both indigenous peoples and local communities. So the parameter here is whether these communities will be directly impacted by the project. So indigenous peoples and local communities have both the right to consent. And in the case that indigenous peoples or local communities decide to do not grant the consent, then in this case the project will not be developed. So it's actually a veto, what is established in the protocol. Another very interesting feature is that project sponsors have to obtain an authorization from communities. And this authorization has a series of characteristics as of course the name of the project developer, proof of their legal capacity, and what are going to be the lands and territories and or resources that are going to be affected, the limitation of the rights as well. So there has to be an authorization that has to be prepared by the project sponsor, and that has to be presented to the community in order to develop the consultation. So it's a request, a previous request, a requirement that is needed if we want to develop the consultation. Another characteristic is that indigenous peoples may actually request the project sponsor a financial amount in order to develop the consultation. This is very important, particularly if we want to guarantee that indigenous peoples have access to independent legal advice, to independent capacity building, so that they are sure that they are able to adopt the adequate decision. So I think that this is a very important element and something that may facilitate that communities actually are really empowered when they finally adopt a decision regarding REDD+. This protocol that I'm talking about deals not only with REDD+, but it also tackles in general any development initiative that is going to be implemented in the communities. There's also a concern in the protocol to facilitate the participation of women, of the others, of youth, of people with disabilities, also of those who are illiterate in Spanish, who are not, of course, illiterate in their languages, but who are illiterate in the language of the dominant society in which they live. So there's also an interest to facilitate the full participation and informed participation of these groups, which also includes, as you can see, those indigenous groups who are living in voluntary isolation. And finally, no project activities can initiate until consent is granted. So this is the last slide that we have on consultation and consent. And the first of the emerging good practices that we are going to share with you deals with how we are going to ensure that communities are aware and that they have the appropriate capacities to engage in a REDD+ process. And here, what we are endorsing is a methodology where community trainers and traditional authorities are the ones who actually lead the consultation and consent cycle. So it's not something where third parties have a leading role, but where the actual lead of the process belongs to communities. And this is very important also to in trying to promote the full empowerment of communities when they participate in a REDD Plus project or initiative. Also, as I have already said, it's very important that information is shared in a culturally pertinent way, and that the capacities of community members are strengthened if required. We have to remember that when we are talking about REDD Plus, we are dealing with a myriad of very technical, complex issues for everybody of us. So, so it's important that communities are also aware of these technical complexities, and that they have the appropriate capacities to engage in this process. And finally, we have to take into consideration also that in the end, the responsibility of a consultation and consent process is of the state. Then it's important also that governments are fully aware of the international duties that they have with regards to the right to consultation and the right to consent. So it's also important that the governments are aware of the international standards that they have to comply with. And this is why we also recommend that to facilitate and enable environment for FPIC, it's important to also develop capacity building activities for government members if required. And the last case study that we brought, it's a case study that was shared by the UN REDD program in Vietnam, and it deals with a local decision-making process that was made in order to develop a REDD Plus benefit distribution system. So this was a consultation process that was developed in 7 villages of Vietnam, and they draw a series of very interesting lessons learned and recommendations. First of all, it's very important, as Jenny said, to take into consideration that consultation and consent are a continuous process. So in this case, they found out that the activities of awareness raising and consent and consultation had stopped 2 years ago with no follow-up. So when they went back to the communities, many of the conveyed information was already lost. So what the consultation team found out is that the many participants were still not familiar with the concept of REDD Plus, and therefore were not familiar also with a particular benefit distribution and sharing mechanism of REDD Plus, which usually involves payments that are based upon performance, and that is a type of different relationship of the ones that community are used to have with the government. So it's very important that all these premises are clear for communities so that they are able to engage in an effective consultation process, particularly regarding a benefit distribution system, as in this case. Also, it's important to make sure that the information actually reaches the communities. So when this information is conveyed to community leaders, it's important to follow up and to make sure that it actually reaches communities. A very important feature is that when we develop this type of processes, we have to ponder what time and location are convenient for the participation of all members of the community. And when I say all members of the community, I would like to highlight the participation of women and of those most vulnerable members of the communities. We have to make sure that not only the elite or those who are directly responsible of adopting decisions are the ones who participate, but also to make sure that that women are invited to participate in a time and location that is possible for them, and that takes into consideration the myriad of responsibilities that they have. Finally, in this process, there was compensation for communities, so this has also to be consulted with community members, since compensation has to be appropriate for them, has to be also culturally appropriate. So this means that compensation perhaps not necessarily needs to be financial, but there can be other types of compensation that communities would prefer. And the final point is that we have to take into consideration that consultation and consent processes have to be accountable. And in order to be accountable, they have to be documented. In this case, the type of documentation preferred were minutes that were signed by the village leader, by a member of the facilitation team, and by a member of the Forest Protection Department of Vietnam, if they were present. We have some publications that deal with the issue that we have just discussed. The first of them is the one that Jenny mentioned, that require an informed consent and REDD Plus guidelines and resources of WWF. This was published in October 2011. And then we also have a publication of the Conservation Initiative of Human Rights, which is a consortium of international environmental NGOs that aim to strengthen the implementation of rights-based approaches to conservation initiatives, including REDD Plus. So the publication that you have here is a publication that tackles REDD Plus issues. So you have the links also in the presentation. So this would be it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa and Jenny, for this very interesting presentation. If you have any questions, please you can forward them to me so I can direct it to Vanessa and Jenny. And thank you again for your time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.